So let me officially welcome all of you out there in TV land to our Voices of Saanich and the Islands. My name's Tex McLeod, and I'm the Vice Chair of Adams Riding Association, Saanich North and the Islands. So what a wonderful evening to have. It's a beautiful, I'm sitting here on the beautiful Saturna Island. This is our third Voices of Saanich for this season. We're going to cut it off after this, take a break for the summer, and then we'll see everyone in the fall and winter series again. And what a wonderful way to close out this part. And let me acknowledge the territory. Let me acknowledge this beautiful land where we are, and the people who have looked after it all of these years immemorial, the Saanich people, and the people of your community, Jody. So it is, I don't really have a set piece. I just think it's so important that we appreciate and understand the land that we have been gifted. And it is struggling right now, and it needs our help. And so with that, I'm actually going to blank myself out. I'm going to hand it over to Adam. I do want to say to folks that if you have questions for Jody, you would put them in the Q&A, and Adam and I will monitor the Q&A and ask Jody as many of those questions as we can throughout the evening. So I'm going to go dark. Adam, I'm going to turn it over to you. Jody, thank you for showing up and being a part of this.
Thank you.
It's great to see him. Taylor, it's Hanapton today. Just Saanich, Saanich, Lungs. My name is Adam Olson. I'm the MLA for Saanich North and the Islands. I get the honor of being able to say that I represent the beautiful lands and waters of my territory of my ancestors in the BC legislature. And I was born and raised on the Chocolate Village here in Brentwood Bay. And it is my honor to welcome Puglass, Jody Wilson-Raybould, for discussion this evening for this edition of the Voices of Saanich. Welcome, Jody.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to join you.
So my dad, his name is Carl, and last September he decided that he wanted to start a book club. And the book club is of authors that, Indigenous authors, and he wanted to invite the broader community in. He's just turned 75, and part of what he wanted to do was share his experience and share the wisdom that he has over the years. And when I reached out to you a few months back, we were reading True Reconciliation, and it was a very inspiring book, and we'll get to there. And maybe just start with a little bit of an introduction of who you are and the journey that you've been on, and kind of where you're at in your journey, and then we'll get into a couple of the books you've written and the content around your experience in the House of Commons and reconciliation as you see it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Gela Kasa, good evening, everyone that's joining over the internet. I'm grateful to have been asked, and I know you asked me some time ago, but how cool is it for me to finish out the season as we go into the summer. But maybe I'll just, as you say, I'll introduce myself, but I also want to acknowledge the territory that I'm on right now. I'm in North Vancouver on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And it's been raining here all afternoon. I understand it's sunny in Victoria and area, but my traditional name, my name is Jody, but my traditional name is Puglass, and that means, in the Kwak'wala language, that means a woman born to noble people. I am incredibly proud to be an Indigenous person in this country, and I always say that I'm equally proud to be a Canadian. I come from the Muskama, Zawadanuk, and Likwikta people, which is from where you are, about 3 hours north on Vancouver Island. And to get to my home community where I live, you take a 10-minute ferry ride to a different Gulf island, a northern Gulf island of Quadra. I grew up in the Comox Valley. My mother, her name is Sandy Wilson. My father's name is Himas Klalilikla. His other name is Bill Wilson. He is the hereditary chief of our clan, the Eagle clan, and his name means number one amongst the eagles, the chief that is always there to help. My grandmother's name is Pugladi. She gave that name to my sister in our Napotlatch, which is, as you know, our traditional form of governance, and perhaps we'll talk a bit more about that. But you know, I'm incredibly proud to come from a very strong and loving family who taught me the values and the principles which I hold to this day, and taught me the laws of our big house and what it means to be Kwak'wala and what it means to be a leader. I was raised to know my rights and my responsibilities, and raised to be proud of who I am and always remember where I come from, and to know that everyone in a community has a role to play, and to ensure that one plays your role. If you can't play your role, then the community suffers. So I was raised to use my skills and abilities such as they are to ultimately contribute and improve quality of life, which has led me down a very mysterious yet fortunate path in life, where I went to law school. I'm very privileged in the sense that I gained a university education at the University of British Columbia. I loved getting my undergraduate degree at UVic. I went on to be a Crown Prosecutor, was elected for almost 7 years as a treaty commissioner with the BC Treaty Commission. From there, politics was calling, and I ran and was elected as the regional chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations, a position that I held for almost 7 years, and representing the communities, 203-ish Indianak bands, or the leadership in British Columbia, was probably one of the greatest privileges of my life. And as life often does, it unfolds in interesting ways. And as an Indigenous person, I mean, we are still working very hard to rebuild our nations, our governing structures, remove ourselves from colonial pieces of legislation like the Indian Act. And for me, towards the end of my tenure as regional chief, with the mandate of our leadership, sought to press the federal government to develop a mechanism to enable Indigenous communities to rebuild their governing institutions within Canada. And I was faced with a federal government that was not so willing to change its laws, policies, and practices. And I remember way back when my grandmother teaching me that if you want to get something done or you want to see change, then you have to get involved and do something about it yourself. So we can talk about that, but that led me to meeting a guy named Justin Trudeau way back when, and my making the decision to run to be a member of parliament. And I was elected for the first MP to represent the amazing riding of Vancouver Granville. And I served as the member of parliament for Vancouver Granville for almost 6 years. 3 of those years, I was fortunate to have been named to the federal cabinet as the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and proudly being the first Indigenous person to hold that position. And I'll fast forward because I know we've got questions and we want to chat. I there's so many things that I'm proud of in terms of the work that I was able to do with an extraordinary team within my minister's office and in the Department of Justice. Some 13 pieces of legislation that found their way to royal assent, that from medical assistance in dying to the legalization of cannabis to opening up, making the judicial appointment process more open and transparent, many other changes, but also working incredibly hard in the face of many, many challenges to create the space for the proper recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights in this country. We're not there yet, but we did push really hard and made some progress. And, you know, as things unfolded, I ended up resigning from cabinet, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, and deciding to run in the 2019 election and run as an independent, to be an independent member of parliament for Vancouver Granville, and was once again given the pleasure and honor of representing the people of Vancouver Granville, this time as the first ever elected independent female member of parliament in our country's history. So I owe much gratitude to certainly my family and my nation and Indigenous peoples, but also to the amazing constituents of Vancouver Granville for putting their faith in me. And Adam, like I see you and I know you're smiling and talking about constituents and how important they are in the work that you do and I did as an elected politician. And if I don't get a chance tonight, I can say it again. I just want to hold my hands up to you and say thank you for the work that you do. I'm not your constituent, but if I could choose an MLA to represent me, you certainly have all of the characteristics and attributes and community-minded leadership that's so important in this day and age. So thank you for what you do, and you've always been a tremendous support to me, and I applaud all of the work that you do within your riding and within the Green Party and within British Columbia. So thanks for having me.
Well, with all due respect to everyone else who gave me an endorsement, that might have been the best one I've got. So thank you so much for that, Jody. And certainly I'm honored by your kind words. I also have a grandma story, you know, and I think that it's important to, you know, I was a not so productive person at one point in my life that, you know, may not have ever got an endorsement like you just gave, or at least the kind words that you gave. I shouldn't call it an endorsement, but it was my grandma. It was
an endorsement. It's okay.
It was the grandma story that turned me around as well. And you know, her direction was to make sure that people were invited to live in this place that we call Saanich, like they belong here. Essentially, is the way that it, you know, to summarize what she said or to paraphrase what she said, that, you know, people don't live here like they belong here. And if they lived here like they belonged here, then they would have a different perspective of this place. And so that is also my origin story politically. And so when I was reading about the stories of your grandma and the stories of your family and the influence that they have on you in terms of being a leader in your community and having that incredible resume that you've just outlined, it resonated with me, the connection to the grandma story and the family story. In your book, Indian in the Cabinet, you go into great detail, you know, of events, you know, and the time that you spent when you were the Attorney General and the Justice Minister, and then later Veterans Affairs, and then the resignation. And one of the things that my dad continued to raise in all the way through the discussions that we had about your books were about the laws of your connections to the laws of the Big House and the teachings that you were given from your from your ancestors and from your family, and then the Big House and the impact that it has on it. I'm really interested in kind of the teachings that you were given, and then what you saw in an elected position in a cabinet in this colonial government, and just would love to hear you reflect on that a little bit, because, you know, those laws of the Big House are so sacred in so many ways, but yet the teachings are, you know, right here at the core. And so what would you say to in reflection on that?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time reflecting on that, and actually one of the reasons that I wanted to, never considered myself a writer necessarily, but one of the reasons why I wanted to put pen to paper or start tapping on the keyboards with Indian in the cabinet, because I felt a responsibility to speak about my experience in so-called mainstream politics within Parliament, within the House of Commons, and certainly within a cabinet. I talk a lot in the book and when I speak publicly about our Indigenous ways of being, and certainly Indigenous peoples are not all the same. We are very distinct, but there's some very strong commonalities. But I'll speak about my culture specifically. As I'm sure you've talked about, I mean, you're longhouse people, we're big house people. There's a lot of commonality that goes along with that. For me, the big house is a very different institution of government, or it functions very differently than Parliament. And one of the major, well, there's a number of ways, but in the big house, there are no, thankfully, political parties. There's no partisanship. The idea of putting forward a position simply to make somebody else look bad, or to take somebody down a couple of notches, or to condemn somebody for having a different opinion is not something that necessarily happens publicly in the big house. I mean, we function, and these are my teachings, and we still practice this today, by way of consensus, by way of building consensus among people, people that have very divergent views. It doesn't necessarily mean in that consensus building process that everyone agrees, but everyone is given the ability to express themselves, express their expertise and their opinion about a particular situation and or idea or goal. But the idea is to come out of those discussions, whether it be in the big house or in Indigenous politics generally, with a way forward that has taken into account the different views and perspectives. And in making decisions that way, even though it takes longer sometimes, most times, the decisions are more enduring, more sustainable, because everyone is, if you want to say it, so-called bought into the idea and has put their backing behind it. That's the worldview that I come from, and that everybody in a community, everybody in the big house has a role to play. There are very different roles, but every role is equally as important to ensure the community functions well. Change from the big house and get on a 4.5 hour flight and go to Parliament. It's a very, very different situation. I mean, I came to Ottawa with an incredibly different worldview than the one that I found myself within. That doesn't mean that I was simply naive about politics and partisanship and the nature of political parties. But what I found there was something that was quite overwhelming in terms of how decisions are made. One, there's a deep entrenchment, and this is not just the case with the federal government, but provincial governments as well. Political parties are very strong, and there is a partisanship and blind loyalty that trumps open discussion and discourse about ideas and evidence around the best ideas and how we can make decisions. What I found in Ottawa was a definite desire to ensure the maintenance of control and power, and that control and power comes at the expense of good ideas, or what I learned as a term, and maybe you have this in the legislature, red meat issues. Those issues, like in the criminal justice system, for example, around mandatory minimum penalties. Red meat issues are those issues that would cause us problem around the dining room tables of Canadians. It would cause us to lose votes, and it would derail our chances of getting reelected in the next election. So doing the right thing or doing the hard thing around issues is put off in order to prepare for, and likely 2 years out, the next election. Partisanship is what is problematic, in my opinion, in terms of mainstream political systems and institutions. And the biggest lesson that I tried to convey in Indian in the Cabinet for me is that Parliament and legislatures across the country and the way politics and partisanship operates can learn a heck of a lot from our institutions of government as Indigenous peoples, our ways of being, our legal orders, and our processes of consensus-based decision-making, all of which have enabled us as Indigenous peoples to survive for millennia.
Yeah, there's a wide gap between the two forms of governance. There's no question about it. I was at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs meetings last week, and I've been to the meetings in the past, but this was the first time that I decided to stay there and sit and just watch and listen and see the discussion and the debate and see the responses to the various ministers that were coming in and out of the meetings, and the various presenters that were giving updates, legal updates, and others. And it was very noticeable that the consensus-based decision-making model that they had there, they were very, very strict on time for the speakers. So the speakers got 10 minutes, and when 10 minutes was over, it was over. But when they got to the resolutions and there was a discussion that was happening, that could take as long as it needed to take in order for people to get to a position, a place that they felt it was okay to vote. And I think, you know, the reality of the House of Commons and the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia is that rather than good governance happening, the political parties are more likely to try to be setting political traps for each other, you know, these pitfalls in order for us to fall into and, you know, to our demise, rather than actually govern. And you know, in our coastal cultural practices and rituals, it's about governing and making decisions that benefit the families and the communities. It's the absolute polar opposite. There's a question here that I think kind of highlights maybe, or you might have an opinion on, around proportional representation, and maybe the impact that might have on modifying the way that the House of Commons and the legislative assemblies, these parliaments, are oriented. Do you have any thoughts on that? There was a question from Brian on this.
Yeah, well, I'm glad Brian brought that up, and I'm hopeful that people continue to bring up electoral reform. I mean, I have publicly been a proponent for changing our electoral system and looking at different ways or different models of proportional representation. There are many around the world. I went to New Zealand to look at their electoral system when I was minister. I mean, changing our electoral system, proportional representation, would open the door for a more representative reality within the House of Commons or within the Legislative Assembly. And I mean, the challenge that we find, and I mean, I can look around the legislature in Victoria to see not very many people that necessarily look like us. We need to increase the diversity within the House of Commons and within our legislatures across the country. And, you know, I was a part of a government that committed to, you know, in 2015, that would be the last election, first past the post election. But be mindful what I said in the last question. I mean, that was the first, I write about this in Indian in the Cabinet. That was the first promise that was publicly not kept. And, you know, that's, that's problematic, certainly, but imagine actually running for a political party and never having been a member of a political party or been a partisan. And this is not the naive point, but people might think I'm naive. Imagine putting something in a campaign literature and saying you're going to do something and then turn around and not doing it. I think that's fundamentally wrong. That's not what voters want. But proportional representation was, aside from housing, was one of the biggest issues that was raised at the doors in Vancouver, Granville when I was running to be a Liberal, but also, and probably increasingly so, when I was running to be an independent member of Parliament. That is where we're going to get more diversity of voices, where people's votes actually matter, and we don't elect a prime minister with 30 to 32% of the vote.
Vancouver Granville did a remarkable thing in electing independents. In our systems, in our parliaments, there are very, very few elected independents. There's a lot of people that end up as independents because they cross the party leader, or because they choose to step away from the party because the values are misaligned, at some point. But very few people elect, or very few ridings, I should say, elect an independent. So that is a remarkable achievement. One of the issues that I've confronted in our legislature is the conflict that Indigenous people have, or that I've experienced. I'll say, maybe not all Indigenous people have, but I've certainly experienced this, where I feel that I have the job that I have to represent my constituents. I have the political brand that I've run under, the values that are represented by the BC Green Party. And then there's the understanding that I have as someone who grew up on an Indian reserve in this country. And so that understanding fuels a whole pile of legislative work that's on my plate that very few other people, only Ellis Ross, I think, carries the same sort of understanding of what it's like to grow up on an Indian reserve in this country. And all the political, everything that's wrapped up in that, I bring into the legislature uniquely. And so I find myself being the one who asks the questions about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I was, briefly before we started this, I was mentioning to you this, I was the one that brought up the problems with the FCURSA agreements and the racist language that is enshrined in those agreements. And there are so many examples of this. I was raising in budget estimates earlier this year about the fact that, Indigenous leaders are the only ones that are asked to volunteer technical and legal time in order to help the government with its goals. Meanwhile, those are resources that are supposed to be helping the nation with their goals, but instead we're volunteering to help is there, and I just say there's this conflict that then Indigenous people who get elected under a party banner have to then be part of the party first, rather than being representative of who they are as Indigenous people or even their constituents. I'm wondering what your thought is around having seats like they do in New Zealand that are designated and somehow populated. And I don't want to prejudge how that would be, because I think it would be something that Indigenous people would have to struggle with and figure out a way. What are your thoughts about having seats that are set aside for Indigenous voices to stand up and be completely away from the partisanship and be able to just raise the important issues that Indigenous people need raised in our parliaments?
Yeah, it's a good question, and maybe I'll try and answer the question, then go back to thinking or talking about how you opened up the discussion in terms of living in many different worlds. And I understand what you're saying in terms of feeling, I've been the first and the only around many different tables, and let's go and ask the Indigenous woman that is here. I am a supporter of affirmative action. I think there's a reason for it in many different circumstances. It's a difficult question for me to answer in the sense, or to give a definitive answer, I should say,
Sure.
Whether or not we're going to set aside seats designated for Indigenous people in Parliament or in legislatures. One, I think there definitely should be more Indigenous people within those institutions. absolutely. Designating seats for them, I think, would change some of the dynamics and certainly some of provide a lot of education and awareness. But I actually do not think that that is how we fundamentally are going to transform Parliament or the legislature or Canada as a whole. Because I think how you opened up your question is the key to how we do that. Learning as Indigenous peoples and as Canadians generally to understand different perspectives, experiences, and realities, understanding different worldviews and how our worldviews create the world around us right now. So understanding, appreciating, and learning about Indigenous worldviews is incredibly important, just as it is for us to understand people from different backgrounds. That's how we break down the silos that exist, I believe, between and among us as Canadians, between and among us as MLAs or as MPs. I mean, we're in a tremendous period of nation rebuilding within Canada right now in Indigenous communities. And for me, I believe that there's an increase of young people and other Indigenous leaders in their communities who are running for council, who are running to be chiefs. Certainly, I would encourage any Indigenous person to put their name forward and run as an MP or an MLA or other elected officials civically or otherwise. But when you do, and even if you're a member of a political party, it's political parties that need to change, that need to not just tick off boxes on a piece of paper, but when they bring people from diverse communities in to actually value and want to learn and listen and understand those differing perspectives. Because when we do, back to the teachings of our grandmother, I'm sure yours taught you this too, when we take into account those differing perspectives within our political party, within our governments, within our legislatures, that's how we're going to make more sustainable decisions. Certainly having seats set aside is helpful, but that's not the ultimate place that I think we want to be. We want to be in that place where the diversity of the legislature reflects the diversity of British Columbia and likewise Canada.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's really, and I think the focus on the political party and those of us who are members of political parties, and I'm assuming that many people here on the call are, it is the responsibility of the membership of those political parties to demand, that we as politicians that are considering which of those issues are the red meat issues, that this needs to be one of those, and that's the reformation of the institutions that we represent in the legislature. So that's I really appreciate that clarity. I'm going to pause here for a second, Jody, and just say that one of the things that we do here on Voices of Saanich is we ask the speakers who they would like a contribution made to. Political parties are always asking for money. And so rather than ask for money tonight to the Riding Association, what we do is we find a charitable organization, or we ask for a charitable organization that the speakers would like us all to donate to and make a contribution to, and we promote those. And I'd just like to say that in the chat soon, if not now, there will be a link to the Downtown Eastside Women's Center, and that is the charity that Jody has chosen tonight. And if you're enjoying yourself this evening, or not even, that is a very, very worthy charity for you to make a contribution to. So the Downtown Eastside Women's Center, there will be a link in the chat. So I just wanted to make sure that we say that a couple of times so that people can go and make a contribution. I just want to
thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for choosing it. It's a very worthy organization. I just want to switch gears here a little bit from the time in the House of Commons, the time in Parliament, and to your book, True Reconciliation, and the guide or the ideas that you leave for Canadians and for everyone who read it about this journey of reconciliation that we're all on together. And rather than have any specific question, maybe I'll just open it up to you to provide what those key messages are in the book. And I certainly hope that people take the time to grab your books and read them, because they're very, very worthwhile reads. They're very informative reads. Maybe just encapsulate the ideas that you've put forward in True Reconciliation, and we'll frame the latter half of this conversation around that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for I wish I gave my last copy away, otherwise I'd show it. Thank you for that. True Reconciliation: How to Be a Force for Change, and it's the third book that I've had published. It came out in November of last year, and like Indian in the Cabinet, but in a different way. I felt, based on all the roles that I've been fortunate enough to play, up to and including being Minister of Justice and being a member of Parliament, and an Indigenous leader, I felt a responsibility to impart some of the teachings and the learnings that I've had over many years. And I sought out in writing True Reconciliation, essentially to answer the question that I am so often asked over many years, and increasingly so in more recent years. The question, which is, how can I advance reconciliation? Individuals ask it, community leaders ask it, politicians ask it, people on the street and people following me into bathrooms in the airport ask it. So I sought to try and answer that question, and the core of the book, it is related in three core practices in terms of approaching our efforts individually and collectively addressing reconciliation. And the three core practices are learn, understand, and act. And very quickly to summarize, in terms of learn, we need to listen and learn from each other, and in doing so, tell of each other's experiences and realities, and also learn the true history of Canada, one that's not told by the few, but told by the many, in terms of, and including Indigenous peoples. So in Learn, I talk a lot about the story of how Canada was formed and Indigenous peoples being left out, so much so that there's over 100 pages in True Reconciliation that I call an oral history, but it tells the story of Canada through the voices of many individuals who were there, non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples alike, from before contact up to and including our recent history. But we need to learn and understand the silos that have been built up in our society and our country because of and due to the reality of colonialism. Understand speaks about our interconnectedness and the need to understand why those silos are there and how we break them down. This is a part that speaks a lot about what we've already talked about in terms of understanding different experiences, different worldviews, and how the worldview that we hold creates the reality that we live in. So understanding connection, but also understanding that there is a direct connection between the socio and economic realities of Indigenous peoples and the lack of the recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights. So addressing the gaps that exist socioeconomically and the lack of recognition, moving from a denial of rights place to create a new reality for Indigenous peoples. And then taking our learnings and our understanding and acting upon those learnings and understanding, and being what I like to call, and I stole this from a dear friend of both of yours and mine. His name is Roshan Danish, but I took his term, which is an in-betweener. We all need to learn to be and act to be in-betweeners. An in-betweener is an individual who tries to bridge between and transcend between the silos that have been built up within this country. And so we can create different patterns of relationships between and among each other, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So we need to learn, we need to understand, and we need to act, and we need our actions to challenge, elevate our understandings. And it doesn't matter who you are. Anything I've learned as a student of history is the big moments, the ones that are written in the history books, are not where we've transformed our society, are not made by leaders, big public officials. They're made by individual actions of people in their own daily lives and experiences, wanting to learn and transcend and bridge the in-betweeners, between the silos that exist between and among us. That's how we create the social change. That's how we're going to address true reconciliation.
As I'm struggling to reconcile the number of questions I have with the amount of time I have left, I am this question, based on the answer that you just gave, I have to ask this question. Thank you, Jody, for your tremendous work in our country, Miigwech. As a woman who has worked across Canada in the public service, I was moved by both of your books and have always tried to be what you coined an in-betweener. Is there any advice for Indigenous women in the public service that you have to offer to continue to impact change that will last for future generations, and we can maintain our health while doing so, and maintain our health while doing so?
I love that question. And whomever you are, you're an in-betweener. And I have to say, thank you for the work that you do as a public servant. I have the utmost admiration and respect for people in the public service. In my public servants, when I was a minister, they have the expertise. They enabled so much of what we were able to accomplish. So know that your job is important, and know that your voice is important. I mean, whether you're in an elected office or you're in the public service and you're Indigenous or from another, marginalized group, I understand those feelings of being marginalized or racialized and being discriminated against, or feeling, like you are a fish out of water to a great degree. My advice is surround yourself by people that share the same values as you, that have the same drive and determination as you do. And there are many, and they don't have to always be Indigenous peoples, but seek out those people around you. And one of the greatest lessons that I learned from my grandmother, that I have always taken with me, I ran in public office, or I've had jobs, and I hold them for and ran for them for reasons, because I wanted to accomplish a goal or goals. And I was relentless in the pursuit of achieving those goals, in particular around advancing Indigenous rights and creating the space for our nations to rebuild, changing the criminal justice system. I was relentless in that, in pursuing what we promised to do. And so much so that I was called difficult for that relentless effort. But know this for me, and I know this for you, whatever ministry you work within as a public servant, those efforts are important. And if you're called difficult for pursuing your goals, for creating change and improving society, then I think that we're all pretty darn happy to be difficult every day of our lives.
Yeah, it's the indication that you're doing important work is when they call you difficult, because the inclination is to just roll with the status quo. It's the easiest, politically, it's the easiest thing to do. It's going to ruffle the least amount of feathers and cause the least amount of waves.
Yeah, 100%. Being an in-betweener is, for the most part, demands being uncomfortable, demands breaking out of the status quo, but that's how change happens. So I bet there's a lot of in-betweeners on this call.
Yeah, I bet you there is. With that, this might be a bit of a rough segue, but I'm going to try it out and see what happens. There's a question here about the difference between Indigenous governance and the colonial government that we have. And have you done much thinking around the space in between that, and in creating a government that has kind of some of the values that that both bring to it, and having a blended government. Like, what are your thoughts about the government and how you've talked about political parties. Is there any structural changes to our colonial governments that, introducing some of those Indigenous values that might improve how they operate?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I think, looking at electoral reform, as we talked about earlier, is a good way to start, because it creates a somewhat of more level playing field and creates more diverse, or potentially could create more diversity. I mean, I found in Parliament, and I don't know if this is the same within the legislature, when I was a minister, certainly didn't have a lot of time to speak to all of the members within the House of Commons, but I found in working on the first piece of legislation that I had to work on under a Supreme Court of Canada deadline, medical assistance in dying, it was myself and my ministerial colleague Jane Philpott who took, as much as we could, a very different approach to developing that legislation, a consensus-based approach where we talked to everybody within the House, within the Parliament, within the Senate as well, and Canadians across the country, and getting that diversity of perspective. So much so, at the end of the day, I believe we found the balance. And jokingly, I've said, everybody was somewhat unhappy with the legislation that we developed. It's because we struck the right balance, I believe. But I think it's incumbent upon political leaders to change how politics is done, how it's done within their political parties, to actually not just speak words, but actually implement the words of actually respecting diversity or doing politics differently. That's how we have to change things, and then input our more Indigenous values, which I think are human values, and valuing the opinion and the perspective of everybody, and knowing that if we do not create the space for everybody to be able to reach their full potential, then our society is going to ultimately suffer. And we see that in politics right now. I mean, one just needs to turn on the news and see how, not just south of the border, but here in Ottawa, how that polarization has created huge challenges for us.
You mentioned a couple times the legislation that you passed when you were a minister, and oftentimes I recognize the times when the spotlight is off. So outside of question period, the rest of the operations of the Legislative Assembly actually don't reflect at all question period. Most of the time, it's very cordial, it's very respectful, there's not a lot of banging. In fact, I think question period is the only time that there's banging on desks, other than when a minister passes a bill that's required a significant amount of work. You'll start to get some cheering, but it's those quiet times in the legislature where the best work get done, the times in the hallways, the conversations that you can have to advance ideas. Outside of the big sort of flagship legislation that you passed, what is the thing that is probably the quietest change you made, or the least well-known change you made, but you think has the potential to have some of the biggest impact?
Oh gosh. You're right. There's a lot of, theater is question period. It's actually named wrong, incorrectly. It should be, you ask questions, but you don't get any answers anyway. I'm not sure I was going there. The things that I'm most proud of, or something that I think is going to and continues to make an impact. And I say this because it's on Indigenous issues. When I was Minister of Justice and Attorney General, with great effort, and not just by myself, but by so many people within government, but within my department, so many lawyers. We pressed, and the last act I did as the Attorney General was literally on the last day as Attorney General, I publicly released a directive on civil litigation for all of the 2,500 lawyers in the Department of Justice, as it was then, the 20th has probably gone up now, but to change the way we approach civil litigation when it comes to Indigenous peoples. And also another document, principles, 10 principles that I worked incredibly hard with colleagues on and was able to, and with Indigenous peoples, principles around what the basis of a respectful relationship should look like between the government of Canada and Indigenous peoples in this country. I think that those two documents have had significant impact, and I'm proud of that. And I know it will continue to, both for having them cited by the Supreme Court of Canada and other judgments, but actually working hard to change the relationship. And I was just in Ottawa at a Lands Advisory Board meeting, and their names will be, they shall remain nameless, but there was 5 Department of Justice officials that came to this meeting and came up to me, and 3 of them were public servants when I was the minister, and they expressed to me how they work hard and fight hard every day to ensure that they implement as best they can those principles and the litigators to try and actually change the way that we look at risk when it comes to going to court and litigating against Indigenous peoples. Again, the premise or the basis or the foundation of which we're trying to get to is to change that relationship to principles that are not based on denial, but are based on the recognition of rights and creating a different trajectory pathway to build respectful relationships where we can all live together. So that's a long-winded answer. I'm a politician, sort of, but still, to your question. But there are the small things, and I don't know if you've had this experience, but some of the legislation that is now law, when I was a minister, and to this day, people come up to me, and whether it's medical assistance to dying or whether it's gender identity and gender expression, changing the Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code, having people come up to you and say how that's transformed their lives. Those are the moments that that make me proud every day to have had the honor of being an MP and the Minister of Justice.
My work is from the opposition benches, and so what's interesting about it, I think that the difference about it is that I will spend some time on an issue for a while and kind of draw attention to it. I take the light and shine it on top of the issue, and like I said, it's most of the time it's happening in those boring times, in the non-question period times, budget estimates where you got half an hour or an hour to really kind of go for a walk with the minister and highlight the problem. And then when it changes, when there was $200 million announced, and in no way do I take any credit for the fact that the government made the change to announce $200 million to support Indigenous leaders to do the technical and legal work on the consultation and engagements that the province is required to do. Because it's, hundreds of Indigenous leaders in the province have been saying this for a very, very long time. But during a budget estimates time, I took the opportunity that was presented me to really do it on the record in public and ask the minister a question. So rather than being the person that gets to say that I did the thing, I'm the person that gets to just poke hard enough and long enough in order to make the point, and to make the government feel the point. And so I really take a lot of pride in being a part of kind of the collective effort that's happening in meetings and boardrooms outside of the legislature. I get to take that in and stand up in question period and, kind of stand on the other floor, on the other side of the floor that you were on, and really help kind of move some of these initiatives forward in BC. So I did have on my bingo card, and I've got all my dabbers out here. I did have on my bingo card the directives of civil litigation. And I think one of the things that I'm really quite pleased with in my time is that we saw Scott Fraser, the former Minister of Indigenous Relations in our province, work very hard to create the conditions here. That you did an incredible job to get those federally, and then he was working for many, many months, many years in order to make sure that our government took those and, repurposed them for BC. But at their core, it is your work that showed up here in BC and is now part of what we're doing. I mean, I think it's really unfortunate that some of the arguments that, I think we can be most critical of for our government lawyers to be, building their cases on are still happening in the province. I guess it's a message of just continuing to be vigilant, I guess, and really calling to them to task on that when we see our government lawyers denying, the existence of Indigenous people, or, questioning it, and then forcing them to defend their existence.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely agree with everything that you've said. I will say it's important to have divergence of opinion. It's important that you stand up and you speak about the issues that matter to you, that matter to your constituents, and that your words hold the government to account, and you bring up issues. I mean, all voices matter. And certainly when I was in a position of being a minister, I mean, I took great account of the divergence of voices that I heard. So continue to do that. In terms of civil litigation, in terms of lawyers, I mean, in the process of reconciliation, true reconciliation, their impetus behind the directive is lawyers have been gaining very outsized roles in this work. And lawyers, even though they speak in different languages, they go to court and courts speak in different languages. And even though the Supreme Court justice said we're all here to stay, it's not judges and lawyers that are going to create the environment for us all to stay together. It's us, you and me, us together, creating different patterns of how we interact with each other. And I mean, certainly in very recent years, if COVID has taught us anything, if environment and climate change has taught us anything, it's that we are fundamentally interconnected and interdependent upon one another, and we have to work as such. So we may need to make every seat in the Legislative Assembly in Victoria, likewise in Parliament, matter. And how we do that, back to another question you asked, is we actually need to change how those processes work, change the standing orders to enable not just leaders of political parties or the opposition or the premier to speak, but to enable voices like yours and others to be able to express the views of their constituents, to bring that diversity of experience and views to the floor to ensure that we make those decisions that are durable.
One of the roles that I've been honored with, I've now, I think, been the official, the interim leader. I'm now the House leader. I was formerly the whip. I was the caucus chair. I've played all of the roles now for the BC Green Caucus. So what happens when there's only two of you? But anyway, I'm now the House leader, and one of the things that, in fact, the opposition House leader Todd Stone and I have been really pushing the government on is reforming private members' time. So because private members' bills in BC don't have a chance. You can we just put private members' bills on, and it's basically like it's an opportunity to do a 2-minute speech about an issue that that you think is important, but the government never calls them for debate. So I think some of the lesser known work that happens in the legislature here in BC, and the work that we can do in light of the fact that we don't have proportional representation, is we can reform the legislature through the standing order. So that is work that I'm on a committee actually this summer to do that work, and looking forward to our first meeting.
Great.
With just a few minutes left, I'm going to just have to apologize to everybody who's asked questions that we haven't answered. There's a few of them there, but nonetheless, I do want to honor your time and really appreciate the time that you've spent with us this evening. We'll just maybe pivot one more time here to just talk about the work you're doing now. You're a former regional chief for the AFN. You're a former federal politician and cabinet minister, and now you are what is the work that you've got going on right now?
Yeah. Well, I have been writing a lot. I guess I consider myself an author now. I have a couple of other book projects in the works. So I'm going to continue to do that. I have been very privileged since leaving politics to be able to speak with many different organizations and groups across the country, a lot on leadership and Indigenous rights and governance issues. And I work with partners in a company that really puts at the forefront rebuilding First Nations Indigenous governance and building on the work that I did, certainly with my husband when I was regional chief, but with the chiefs of British Columbia. We put together a governance toolkit, which we call the Guide to Nation Building. So we're working on updating and continuing to develop tools for Indigenous communities and nations to rebuild their institutions of government and move forward in this tremendous period of nation rebuilding.
One of the things that I've noticed, and we almost got out of this conversation, I have at least one more question for you. But
Sure.
in that governance rebuilding or that governance building exercise, one of the things that I've noticed in BC, I don't know to what extent you noticed it in the federal government, but that the language has changed, but the relationship kind of remains the same. So we've gone from talking about Indian reserves and bands and band councils to nations, but it's the exact same unit that existed previously. There's been no time left, or very little time left, from the colonial government's perspective for that work of governance, the rebuilding of governance, or the building of governance in some case, to happen without the provincial crown just reframing the way it is that they've always related. Is that?
Yeah.
What's your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, if I understand what you're asking, I mean, there's been a lot of changes. I mean, I think that we need to recognize that we've made significant progress, but we have a lot of work still to do. Some of that is changes in language. I talk about this a lot in True Reconciliation in terms of different approaches or what we can do for reconciliation, and specifically what governments have done. And I talk about substantive reconciliation as well as performative reconciliation. I mean, words matter, and what we say and how we address one another matters. And I guess this is a segue for me into talking about UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, just briefly, and to recognize that, in 2019, the government of British Columbia, to its credit, brought in DRIPA, which is an act that brings in UNDRIP into British Columbia law, and the federal government has done so too. But I think in a roundabout way, or a 10,000 feet way, to address your question, governments have not done the necessary work. Yes, they've brought in UNDRIP into Canadian law and to British Columbia law, but at the same time, the Indian Act still exists. At the same time, there's the Mineral Tenures Act. There's other acts in British Columbia that actually have been drafted as if Indigenous peoples do not exist. We need to change that. UNDRIP adoption is a first step. What we need to do is to have a comprehensive framework that will recognize and implement Indigenous rights. And we haven't got there yet. The federal government and the provincial government have not changed their laws, policies, and practices to enable Indigenous governments and nations to rebuild, to do the transformative work that is required. That's what we have to do in terms of the opportunity. And the Trudeau government in Ottawa promised to do that on February the 4th of 2018 in a momentous speech in the House of Commons, promised a rights recognition framework which would recognize and create mechanisms to rebuild Indigenous nations and dispute resolution processes, but in the end did nothing. So we can develop all the action plans in the world around UNDRIP in terms of British Columbia or federally, but we actually have to do something, which is change laws, policies, and practices. So Adam, continue to press the government to do what they promised to do in 2019. It's not easy, but it is fundamentally transformative work that will not only create improved quality of life and change the reality on the ground in communities, Indigenous communities, which is the litmus test to whether or not any legislation is impactful. We haven't necessarily seen that, or we haven't seen it consistently. We need to change that, and government needs to get their own house in order and change those laws, policies, and practices. And Indigenous nations need to do our work and rebuild.
That's the act part on behalf of the provincial government. That's their action that they need to take, and as part of their true reconciliation. It was a remarkable moment to be sitting in the legislature, no doubt, when we passed the Declaration Act. It was the turning of a page from from what was to what potentially can be if we continue to hold government accountable and demand that they follow through on the commitments that they've made. So that is the act part, and I think it's a great place to leave it. And I just want to remind everybody, and there is a link in the chat, if you can see it, to the Downtown Eastside Women's Center. If not, all you need to do is Google the Downtown Eastside Women's Center, and please make a donation on behalf of the event that you attended this evening. And really thank you, Jody, for bringing forward the Downtown Eastside Women's Center as the charity that you're highlighted tonight. And really thank you for taking an hour or so out of your time to hang out with us this evening and have a conversation about reconciliation and your experience. And there could have been 2 or 3 more hours. I'm sure we could have filled it. I'm really honored with the time that we had this evening, and raise my hands to you in gratitude. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and maybe we can do it again at some point. But I'm grateful to everybody that tuned in, and thanks for your leadership in British Columbia, Adam.
And thank you for yours. And there are definitely enough questions to populate a whole other conversation, that's for sure. But we'll leave them on the sideline. I think we covered in general terms most of the topics that they wanted to cover. So Jody, thank you so much for your time this evening. And thank you to the Saanich North and the Islands Riding Association for continuing to support the work we do in our riding, and to continue to support me as the MLA. I'm grateful for all of the volunteer work that you do. Thank you, Alex, for hosting us this evening. And with that, I think we'll shut down. And if you take a look at the time, we hit it right at 10 minutes after 8. So there we go.
Amazing.
Have a wonderful dinner with your husband.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care. Night.
Bye-bye.